This is The World Unpacked. Welcome back. I'm your host, Doug. Today, we're going to talk about the Arctic. And when I think of the Arctic, I think of polar bears and, nature shows. But it actually has become a theater for geopolitics, with the Russians and the United States battling it out for resources, shipping lanes, military bases, and a whole bunch of other issues. The Chinese have shown an interest, and other states like Norway, Canada, and Denmark, plus the indigenous people who inhabit the area, all have interests at stake. Climate change is creating another hotbed for global competition over ideology, over security, and more. And here to explain it all is Paul Stronski, my colleague and a senior fellow in the Russia and Eurasia program at the Carnegie Endowment. Here we go. Paul, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so we're going to talk about the Arctic today, and I want to start with the most basic question. And I have to ask, because the Arctic is a frigid, cold place. There's not a lot of people. So what is important about the Arctic that is generating so much geopolitical interest?
I think you highlighted it. This is an area that was not, the world was not as interested in it 20, 30 years ago. And I think one of the main reasons we're seeing greater interest is because of climate change. Climate change is opening up the region to greater human activity. It is opening up the region to a search for more natural resources, hydrocarbons, oil and gas is number one. But we are also seeing interest in timber, other precious metals, other things that is in the permafrost that is now melting. And we're seeing, it's a huge area source of food with the fisheries. So we are seeing a lot more global interest here because there's a lot more opportunity for economic activity, both some positive, some negative. But this is one of the reasons why I think we're seeing, the United States focus more on it. We're certainly seeing the Russians focus more on it. We're seeing the Chinese step up their interest. So we're really seeing this becoming sort of one of the latest places of global geopolitical competition.
So I want to, as I often do, run through the players who are sort of central to what's going on in this region. And there are basically 6 or 7 countries. Let's see if I can name them all. It's the United States, Russia, Finland, Norway, Denmark, Canada. Am I missing anybody, Paul?
Iceland.
So these countries all have borders to the region. And I want to sort of group a few of them together, for example, Norway and the others. What are their interests in this region, geopolitically, strategically, for security, economics, et cetera?
Well, I think I'll start with the European, the non-Russian European Arctic states. I think, Norway is one of the few NATO countries that actually shares a land border. It is one that shared a land border during the Cold War with NATO expansion and NATO's continued expansion with Finland and Sweden joining. The number of countries sharing a NATO country sharing a border with Russia is increasingly dramatically. But this has always been a tense area of east-west tension throughout the Cold War. Norway is also a very wealthy country. It has lots of oil and gas up in the far north, lots of other resources. So this is certainly, the Norwegians are certainly very interested in this, and they're very interested in sort of monitoring how this region is shifting. That in addition, we've seen the weaponization of migrant flows coming through the Arctic. Strangely enough, over the last several years, migrants from Afghanistan have shown up on the Finnish and Norwegian border, probably assisted by the Russian government to get there. So there's interest in sort of cross-border transit flows from these countries, and then there's a lot of economic opportunities there. The various different natural resources, oil and gas, minerals. We are seeing companies, we're seeing other countries be looking at places like Greenland, looking at places like Iceland. And so this is what's driving many of the Europeans' interest in the Arctic.
Okay, so that's one grouping of states. But the key driver of engagement here is really the Russians, who are the most heavily engaged in building military bases. I read that a Russian expedition sort of planted a flag sort of outside of the or in disputed territory in the Arctic, and some countries like Norway and others complained you can't just plant a flag and claim it for your own. This isn't sort of the 18th century.
Russia has set up a new Arctic command. It has opened hundreds of new and former Soviet-era Arctic military sites,
So
including airfields.
the Russians are driving this. Tell us why they're so interested in the Arctic.
Well, first, they are the country with the largest Arctic border. Russia is 11 time zones long, and that it covers the entire Arctic. So they have a border, which in the far north, that with global warming is suddenly becoming something they need to defend. They've never had to defend that like they have to defend that to today. And the Russians kind of see the Arctic very similar to the way we kind of see the Gulf of Mexico as their privileged, area that nobody else is supposed to impede on their territory. The Arctic is very important in Russian history as well, just as Siberia is. Russia's drive to the east, drive to sort of colonize the region, looking for resources. It drove Tsarist policies there. It drove Soviet policies there. The Soviets invested heavily in the region. Some of it was using slave labor, gulag labor, but that's how they developed a lot of the infrastructure and cities up there. But then also the oil industry, which was the backbone of the Soviet military. It is what kept the Soviet economy afloat during the height of the Cold War. Now, today, all those similar legacies, the historical legacy, the cultural legacy, the Russians really feel themselves as an Arctic state, are still there. And Putin is able to recover from the crazy, impoverished 1990s once again by tapping the resources of the Arctic, namely the oil and gas, but also others. 10% of Russian exports, this is before the sanctions, of all Russian exports came from 20% came from the Arctic, and 10% of Russian GDP emanated from the Arctic region. So it's a key economic driver, and one that has really helped Russia recover, regain global stature, as well as really the Putin regime rests on this economic structure that is dependent on oil and gas, much of which comes from the Arctic.
So I know you formerly worked on the U.S. strategy for the Arctic when you were in the Obama administration, so you're really well positioned to tell us what the U.S. interests are. And I would note we're coming right on the heels of an announcement by President Biden that he's going to name an Arctic ambassador, sort of changing the U.S. Stance on the region. So tell us about the U.S. interests here.
Yes, well, I'm very pleased about President Biden's decision. The United States is one of the last countries, I believe, the last country, Arctic nation, to actually name such an official. So I think this will really allow us to heighten up our diplomatic engagement in the region, and it's a region that has become much more complicated to act, both because of climate change and the war in Ukraine and the tensions that are emanating from that. So I think this is a very timely decision. I would say the United States, in many ways, is playing catch up in the Arctic. I'm from the East Coast. I first went to the state of Alaska at age 32. Growing up, I didn't consider the United States an Arctic nation, and I would imagine a lot of Americans don't consider ourselves an Arctic nation, but we are. Alaska is Alaskans certainly know that, and the Alaskan congressional delegation has certainly been arguing for a more robust approach and to show greater leadership in the region. But we really haven't had the need to do that because we've seen the region as an area that has been calm. It has been an area of cooperation until the last decade, particularly after the Cold War. It was highly militarized in the Cold War, but in the post-Cold War, the United States was focused on other issues. And so it was only with climate change, it was only with the rise in tensions with the Russians that we really started to respond and really try to sort of up our presence and our game there. I just remember, the 2011 was a time in the state of Alaska when the city of Nome was frozen over, and the United States had only one functioning icebreaker at that time, and we needed help. We turned to the Russians, and the Russians actually helped us with their more capable icebreakers open up the port. And so we've seen the Coast Guard, we've seen the state of Alaska, we've seen the U.S. military ever since then really highlight the need to increase our icebreaking capability, increase our ability to operate in that region. And so ever since, the Obama administration had a policy, the Trump administration also had a policy that looked at both the economic opportunities of the Arctic, but also the sort of the climate issues and the environmental issues and the geopolitical issues, and both have tried to balance these, to various different extents. But we're finally seeing ourselves, enhance our posture, invest in the Arctic, and I think Biden's decision is sort of the latest example of that.
All right, I want to touch on two other players. First, China. China does not have a border, so to speak, with the Arctic, but for some reason they've decided it's really important. Tell us why China's so invested in this region.
Well, first of all, this is the new sort of global area where everybody's interested. So to be a global power, Russia wants to be engaged in the Arctic, and China increasingly wants to be engaged in the Arctic. Now, some of this makes perfect sense. We are seeing, global warming is leading to Arctic and Antarctic ice melt, which is causing sea levels to rise. That's causing coastal countries like China, like Singapore, like others that have Netherlands that are not Arctic countries, have grown more interested in the Arctic in the last decade. So that is one reason. And so there's some legitimate concerns about global warming. But then the Chinese are also looking at infrastructure opportunities. They're looking at investment opportunities. They're looking at longer term deals to secure oil, gas, and other minerals. So what we've seen is China really up their game as well, but investing in some of these smaller Arctic countries. There was a delegation of senior Chinese visitors to Alaska just a couple years ago, and so we're seeing them enhance their presence both on the global stage but also on the regional stage, and they increasingly present themselves as a near Arctic state. In 2013, the Chinese achieved observer status in the Arctic Council. That is, they're privy to all of the meetings, they're able to attend, and so they are, essentially now a stakeholder in the Arctic Council.
I want to get back to the Arctic Council and the collapse in a little bit, but before we do, there's another group that's part of the Arctic Council that is not necessarily a state with geopolitical aspirations for the region, and that's the indigenous groups who inhabit the Arctic. Tell us a little bit about how they influence policy and their interests in Arctic geopolitical issues.
Well, one of the interesting pieces of the Arctic Council, which was created in 1996, is that it involves multi-stakeholders. So it involves governments, it involves states, it involves civil society groups, and the most important are the indigenous people from across the Arctic. This is an area where they meet, they engage, they can talk about the challenges of that face indigenous people in this fast-changing geopolitical environment. So they are key stakeholders here. And in certain Western countries, they actually have a greater voice. Russia's highly authoritarian, and so it's been much harder to engage Russian indigenous peoples than it is to bring together Canadian American and Norwegian indigenous people. So they are a key stakeholder, but this is one of the areas where the Arctic Council doesn't work as well, simply because the Russians do not want a whole lot of people-to-people engagement with Americans and Europeans.
So let's talk a little bit more about the Arctic Council, which sort of collapsed a little bit because of the war in Ukraine and just the breakdown of relations globally driven by the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the war there. But I want to start with a little bit of background, because the Arctic formerly, really up until 6 to 8 months ago, was a place where there was a lot of flourishing multilateral state cooperation, especially on climate. So tell us sort of about that era and then how that collapsed.
Yeah, there's a lot of regional cooperation, a lot of scientific cooperation, a lot of what we've been doing over the last 30 years since the end of the Cold War is try to enhance international understanding of the Arctic, bringing scientists together. Then, as the Arctic, as we started to see the impacts of climate change, we were cooperating with the Russians in Coast Guard forums and search and rescue exercises. One of the big threats of the Arctic, of now that there's more shipping going through, now that there's tourists, more fisheries up there, the potential for a big environmental or public health accident, a cruise line going down, is all there. So until the Ukraine war, we were able to pretty much work through relative coast guards, through search and rescue on these issues. But what we've seen is a much more challenging environment. The Russian invasion, the first invasion and annexation of Crimea, made this a very difficult place to work on. I remember in the Obama administration, I had to make a call and tell we were actually having a meeting about the Arctic with the Russians, and I had to call the U.S. delegation and tell them they needed to leave the meeting because Russia had just annexed Crimea. It's just gotten worse since then. There's a lack of trust. There is not a whole lot of desire to exchange information the way there was before. And then what we've also seen is that the invasion of Ukraine has spooked other countries of the High North. Finland and Sweden have applied for NATO membership in direct response to the invasion of Ukraine. And that is certainly was going to enhance Russian threat perceptions. The Russian invasion enhanced Finnish and Swedish threat perceptions. We're now seeing the reverse happening here. And so we're seeing a much more competitive, a much more militarized region. Now, it's probably not as militarized as everybody says. I mean, the Russians, very often we see the Russians struggling in Ukraine. A lot of what they've put back up into the high north, into the Arctic, is renovating old Soviet facilities, or it's dual use. It can be used for commercial or military purposes. But we are seeing the potential now for an east-west conflict. It runs from the Arctic all the way down sort of through the Black Sea between Russia and NATO. And so we've seen how this tension in the world over Ukraine has the risks of bubbling into the Arctic. I don't see the Arctic as an area where a conflict will start, but there's certainly repercussions for the Arctic of what's going on in the global environment.
When we come back, I'll ask Paul about climate, economics, and security in the Arctic. Hey, World Unpacked listeners, I hope you're enjoying the episode. For more great episodes of The World Unpacked, make sure to hit that subscribe button on your preferred podcast platform. And tell all your colleagues at the State Department, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, or just the next folks you have over for dinner that they should subscribe to. Thanks for listening. So there's sort of three prongs to Arctic policy as far as I can tell, and that's climate, economics, and security. And I think climate is really the place you have to start because so much of the other two is linked to climate change, which essentially has unlocked resources, shipping opportunities, and security competition in the region. So what's the climate story here, and how does Russia and the United States interact over that key issue?
Well, certainly, I think that's one of the United States and Russia are also neighbors in the Arctic. We do share the maritime border, and it generally has been stable. Throughout the Cold War, certainly there was frictions, but what we're seeing is climate change is changing the whole environment in Alaska, in Siberia. The Russians see this as key to its economic development and its future economic development. And they are investing in there. As I said, they now need to defend the area. It's a very long border that they now feel compelled to defend. And Putin also sees the climate change until basically just the past year. The Russians saw it as a boon. They saw climate change as opening up agriculture, opening up economic opportunities, making the area more viable. And so whereas we in the United States, in Europe, very often generally see climate change as a threat to the future. Russia has seen it more as an opportunity. I think before Ukraine happened, the Russians had a little bit of a wake up. We've had some very bad oil spills up in the Russian Arctic. We've had some horrific fires up in the Arctic, in the Russian Arctic, and we've had infrastructure, roads and rails. As permafrost melts, there goes the infrastructure you just put in. So I think the Russians more recently have realized that they need to come to the table on climate change, but getting them to do anything in this current environment is going to be quite challenging.
I want to pick up on this theme of sort of economic opportunity paired with climate catastrophe, right? I mean, you're saying the Russians, until very recently, viewed the climate and its changing nature in the Arctic as an opportunity. I think something like 40% of the world's unexplored oil reserves and 30% of its gas is locked in the Arctic. There's, I'm sure, tons of other commodities to be accessed there. I certainly am afraid of climate change and what it'll do to the entire world. But, you could make a theoretical argument that it is at least an opportunity in this region. So how do we make sure that we solidify not only the Russian view, but the global view that we should close off these opportunities on behalf of climate?
Well, I think, the challenge that we face is both, yes, climate change is opening up opportunities, but it's also opening up, unique challenges. And we are going to see, as climate change opens up, fish populations are moving, bear populations are moving. We're seeing forest fires. We're seeing, rise across the region in places that have never witnessed this. And so we are seeing very dramatic and quick change in the region, and whether it's the United States, whether it's Canada, whether it's Norway, or whether it's Russia, we're struggling to respond to that. I also think, while there's a lot of opportunity coming out of the Arctic, there's also a lot of economic challenges as well, in that the infrastructure, as I said, is collapsing in Russia, and how do you shore it up? But then, while there's some grand plans for development in the Arctic, this is still a very difficult environment in which to work. The Russians, for example, they want to develop a sea route that is theoretically drastically reduces the number of days it takes to ship items from Asia to Europe. The problem, though, is that it's a very difficult environment. You need to put weather and radar stations, and you need to put ports up throughout the region to make this viable. You need to get insurers willing to insure maritime operations in a very inhospitable environment. And so what we've seen is, while this new route, it's called the Northern Sea Route, certainly functions, not all of the ships that are going through, that the Russians claim are going through, are actually making it all the way through. They make it partially the way through, and then it goes on rail or others. So it's really not a very efficient way. And so it's how to make how to take advantage of these challenges, of these economic opportunities, acknowledge the challenges, the economic and infrastructure challenges. So it's a very difficult task, and I don't think any one state can do it on its own. I mean, I think there's got to be a lot of cooperation here, and I'm worried, given the current state of Russia-West relations, but also China's increasingly an actor, China-West relations. It's going to be much more difficult to do in the future.
I want to stick with this economic conversation for a second. I know in the United States, we talk a lot about the Arctic, and most often in the domestic context, that's really about oil and gas and drilling. It's become a very partisan, polarized issue. I think most of the American listeners of this podcast will be very clear on that. Is it sort of true that the Russians and perhaps the Chinese are looking at the trade shipping lanes as a way to circumvent what is essentially like American naval power and dominance?
Yes.
So this is what they're really pushing. But I mean, how realistic is it that the high north shipping lanes will become a real opportunity and counter option to ones that are more commonly used by the West?
Yeah. Well, I mean, a lot of these are being pushed first and foremost by the Chinese. The Chinese have their Belt and Road Initiative, and they have a Silk Road Initiative that goes through the Arctic. The Chinese do not want to, depend on the Straits of Malacca, which it's all U.S. friendly, large U.S. naval presence. So they've been investing in alternative road, rail, and sea routes. And the Northern Sea Route is one of them. And it makes perfect synergies for the Russians. The Russians need the investment up there. They need the technological know-how that they don't have to make that a viable route. But as I said, it is right now it's not really viable economically. You can't. Most ships are not capable of passing through the entire Northern Sea route. You need heavy-duty icebreakers in order to do that, and there's lots of international disagreements over, who the Russians only insist that you have a Russian icebreaker escorting any ship across the Northern Sea route. So it's a very challenging thing to do just diplomatically, but then sort of the economic costs we're seeing, and I think the Ukraine war is adding more. So what we've seen is, China invested in a railroad that ran from Kazakhstan across Russia into Belarus into Europe. After sanctions, after the Ukraine war, that is no longer a viable route anymore. So the Chinese have pretty much abandoned it. And I think, because of the challenges of transporting things through the Arctic, and then the sort of reputational risks of transporting anything through Russian ports, really is going to limit the ability in the future of Russia to develop this. It's a dual challenge. It's the harsh climate, and then the uncertainty over Ukraine, and the sanctions regime that is there. It's unclear. Most countries, if you can ship it a different way, why even go risk shipping it through Russia? And so that's what we're seeing right now.
All right, let's turn to the security competition. So certainly both the United States and the Russians have been building facilities and doing training exercises and so forth in the Arctic. Can you talk a little bit about sort of the balance of power here, and sort of the dynamics of the security competition between these two great powers in the Arctic?
Mm-hmm. Well, as I said, Russia is driven, or was driven first and foremost, I think, by climate change and the need to sort of shore up that northern boundary, which it has never had to really defend before. And so I think, what we did see is starting about a decade ago, Russia started to invest in modernizing old Soviet facilities, enhancing its northern fleet. Russia sort of sees this region as sort of essential to its ability to operate. It's got St. Petersburg is not in the Arctic, Murmansk is in the Arctic, but these are the two sort of northern ports that it has, and so it sees the region increasingly as a sort of NATO area. And it's trying to push back on that. It feels a threat to its conventional and nuclear capabilities from NATO's growing presence, more capable and precise weapons that the alliance has. A lot of what Russia is putting up there is dual use. It's commercial. It is military, so it can be used for dual functions. And then, the West has responded as well. We are investing more. The United States certainly has refocused its attention on icebreaking, as have Finland and others. The addition of Finland and Sweden into the NATO alliance is certainly enhancing the alliance's military capabilities overall, but particularly their capabilities to operate in the high north. And so, what we're seeing is sort of two sides seeing threats from the other, and that threat level is rising. I generally think we've been able to cooperate in the Arctic. It's not as volatile as, say, the Black Sea, but the Arctic is, with NATO expansion, with this intense global animosity, it's certainly an area where we could have tensions spill into the Arctic as opposed to an Arctic conflict. But I think the Arctic is now connected to the rest of the world through climate change and now through geopolitics. And so this is one of the big concerns I have is how do we keep this an area of low tension while the rest of the relationship between the West and Russia is of high tension.
I want to push back a little bit, kind of in a crazy way, because I asked you on the show, and I do think these issues are important, but I want to try to reframe this and challenge an assumption here. In preparation for this episode, I spent a lot of time looking at Google Maps. I found almost no large settlements, so very few people. I found like an Ace Hardware store called On Top of the World Ace Hardware store. I found a Tim Hortons on a Canadian military base called Alert, which is like right at the tip of the northernmost province in Canada. This is a harsh terrain. I mean, this is like, for you Star Wars fans out there, like the Hoth battle, right? This is just ice, and it's frozen, it's cold, it's hard to survive. Climate change has made it even harder to build things there. Is this really a new platform, a new theater of geopolitical competition that must be very seriously considered? Or is this basically just a competition on every level that extends to this region that may not actually be as dangerous to the United States, to Russia, and these other countries as being described?
Yeah, I mean, I would I think when you look at it, yes, the region is scarcely populated. The Russian Arctic, in particular, is scarcely populated. That is one reason why it makes doing all the development and the exploration up there quite challenging, because there's not the experts who can deal with oil spills. There's not the expert who can deal with natural disasters in the Arctic. So if something goes wrong, states don't necessarily and local environments don't necessarily have the capacity to respond. But the world is changing fast. Climate is opening up new opportunities. Some of the resources we need for the precious metals we need for the energy transition are up in the Arctic. So people are going to continue to look at the Arctic, whether or not it will become a viable long-term economic opportunity remains to be seen. I think certainly in the Western countries that are Arctic countries, where there's a little bit greater stewardship, a little bit more involvement of the indigenous populations and care and stakeholdership of those indigenous populations. There might be greater long-term opportunities that are going to have to be balanced. But I do think, particularly in the era of sanctions, in the era when Russia has had, it's kicked several oil companies have left the country, and then Russia has also, tried to prevent others from selling their assets for a profit as they leave the country. And so what we're seeing this, it's highly risky, particularly in the Russian Arctic, to do any sort of business, to do any sort of exploration, and I think that will remain the case. That is a problem because we in the United States, Europe, Canada have the greater expertise of how to work safely in the Arctic. Russia needs that, but because of the Ukraine crisis, it's not something that they will be able to get. And so what I think we are going to see is while Russia might not like it, we're going to see certainly a greater influence of China coming up in the Arctic, simply because of how this geopolitical framework is shifting, where the West is now seen against Russia in the Arctic, and the only ways Russia will be able to develop its resources up there is with the Chinese. And so I think we're seeing a sort of a shift. This is also impacting Russia-Chinese relationship because the Arctic is increasingly important aspect of that.
Paul, thank you so much for coming on and explaining these issues in this important and really under-discussed region. And we're grateful.
Great. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of The World Unpacked, a podcast produced by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts, and if you like the show, please rate and subscribe. The World Unpacked is produced by Cliff Jayapranada and Clarissa Guerrero, and edited by our audio engineer, Tim Martin. See you next time.